The boy came at her in a dead run, not strolling, not pausing to think, but sprinting with everything he had. His head was bent low, his boots hammering the dusty ground, his arms driving back and forth like his very survival depended on it. She barely managed to step aside before he collided with her skirts, throwing his arms around her waist and holding on with a fierceness that caught her completely off guard. His face was buried against her stomach, his small shoulders trembling, his breath coming in ragged, broken gasps as though he had just run a great distance. "Mama," he sobbed, "you actually came back." The words struck her like a physical blow. The world around them seemed to freeze in place. The groaning of the train, the hiss of escaping steam, the low murmur of townsfolk all faded into a muffled, distant hum. She stood there staring down at the child clinging to her, her heart hammering against her ribs, her mind reaching desperately for logic where there was none to be found. Her voice faltered and broke. "I think you may have made a mistake, sweetheart." He shook his head with fierce determination. "No, it's you. I knew it the moment I saw you." A man's voice cut through the noise, sharp and rough with alarm. "Eli!" She looked up to find him moving toward them through the swirling dust. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark eyes wide with panic and disbelief. He reached the boy and took hold of him, gently but firmly, trying to ease him back. "Eli, let go now." "I'm so sorry," he said, glancing up at her. He doesn't know what he's saying, but the boy only held on tighter. "She is Mama," he cried out. "I know she is." The man went completely still. For one suspended moment, the entire platform fell silent. The woman, Maribel Hayes, felt every set of eyes on the platform swing toward her. She could feel the weight of their curiosity, their judgment, and their pity pressing in from all sides. She drew herself up slowly, steadied her racing heart, and met the stranger's gaze directly. "I'm very sorry," she said, keeping her voice soft and even. "I believe your son has mistaken me for someone else." He looked at her then, really looked, studying her face with an intensity that felt almost unbearable. Something passed across his expression, something difficult to name. Grief, perhaps, or shock, or the ghost of a memory rising unexpectedly to the surface. "I apologize," he said again, his voice dropping lower this time. "It has been an incredibly hard year for him." The boy finally loosened his grip, though he did not step away or take his eyes from her face. He stared up at her with an expression of desperate, fragile hope, as if he feared she might simply vanish the moment he looked elsewhere. "I thought you were Mama," he whispered. Maribel felt a deep ache rise in her throat and pushed it down. She lowered herself until they were level with each other, eye to eye. "I'm not," she told him gently, "but I am very glad that I found you here." The boy held her gaze, studying every detail of her face with a heartbreaking seriousness, as though he needed to memorize it before she disappeared. Then he gave one slow, solemn nod. "I'm Eli," he said, "and I'm Maribel." Behind them, the train released a long and mournful whistle that rolled out across the wide open plains, a sound that spoke of farewells, of endings, and of something else entirely that neither of them could yet put into words. Only minutes before, Maribel had stepped down from that very same train with her heart lodged firmly in her throat, and everything she owned packed into one battered, worn suitcase. She had traveled 3 full days from Pennsylvania, riding through dust and relentless sun and sleepless, restless nights, holding tight to the hope that the man she had agreed to marry would be standing there at the end of the line, waiting for her. But he was not there. She had stood on the platform and scanned every face, watching strangers embrace and part ways around her. Her hope had grown thinner with every minute that passed. No tall man with kind eyes, no handwritten sign bearing her name, no one stepping forward to claim her arrival. Only silence. And then the boy. Now She stood, caught between his small hand clutching her skirt, and the steady, measuring gaze of the man who had come running after him. "My name is Caleb Turner," he said at last, "and I am truly sorry for all of this. My son lost his mother last winter." Maribel nodded slowly. She could hear it clearly in his voice, the crushing weight of grief, the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had been carrying far too much for far too long. "Please don't worry," she said. "I didn't mean to upset him in any way." She paused, glancing around the platform. "I only just arrived. I was here expecting to meet someone." He tilted his head slightly, a small frown forming. "Someone? Yes." She hesitated, feeling suddenly foolish for even saying the name aloud. A man named Miles Dandridge. The effect was immediate and unmistakable. Caleb's jaw went rigid. His eyes darkened. Whatever warmth had been in his expression hardened into something altogether sharper. "Dandridge?" he repeated. The way he said it made her stomach sink like a stone. "You know him?" she asked. "I do," he replied, "and I am sorry to have to tell you this, but if you were counting on him to meet you here today, you may find yourself waiting a very long time." The words hit her like a wave of cold water. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Caleb glanced briefly down at the boy, then brought his eyes back to her. "I think it would be better if we found somewhere a little quieter to talk." The platform was still crowded with travelers and with onlookers who were doing a poor job of pretending not to listen. Maribel felt suddenly and acutely exposed, as though everyone around her could see the truth she was struggling not to face herself. "Yes," she said quietly. "That would be a good idea." Caleb nodded and placed a steady hand on his son's shoulder. "Eli, go on ahead to the wagon." The boy looked back and forth between them, hesitating, then gave a small nod and ran off toward a dusty, travel-worn wagon nearby. Maribel watched him go, then turned back to Caleb. "I'm sorry if he frightened you." "He didn't," Caleb said plainly. "He simply hasn't had an easy year." "Neither," she thought to herself, "have I." They walked together in silence toward the wagon, heat shimmering and rippling in the air around them. Maribel's heart beat faster with every step as she braced herself for whatever he was about to tell her. "I don't quite know how to say this gently," he began, stopping beside the wagon. "But Miles Dandridge is not the man he presents himself to be." Her breath caught. "What do you mean?" "He is not someone you should place your trust in," Caleb said. "He has done this before. He places advertisements, makes promises of marriage, and then disappears when circumstances don't suit him." The words dropped into her like heavy stones. "He wrote letters to me," she whispered. "He said he wanted a wife, a home, a future. He made promises." "He makes a great many promises," Caleb said quietly. "And he keeps very few of them." Her legs felt suddenly unsteady. She reached out and gripped the side of the wagon to keep herself upright. "I sold nearly everything I had to come here," she said. "I have no place left to go." Caleb watched her carefully, taking in the fear she was trying so hard to conceal, the way her shoulders were braced and rigid, as if she were steeling herself against yet another blow. "You can stay at my place for tonight," he said after a long moment, "just until you have a chance to figure out your next step." She looked at him sharply. "I don't want to be a burden to you." "You won't be." His voice was quiet and certain. "You are not safe out here alone, and I have no intention of leaving you stranded." A gust of wind swept dust across the platform between them. Somewhere behind them, the train whistle sounded again, long and achingly lonely. Maribel drew in a slow breath and steadied herself. "Thank you," she said softly. Caleb gave one brief nod. "Come on, then. It's not far." As they walked together toward the waiting wagon, she felt the full weight of the day come to rest on her shoulders. The carefully planned future she had built in her mind had crumbled before it ever had a chance to begin. And yet, strangely, something deep inside her felt more settled and more grounded than it had in months. She did not know this man. She did not know this town. She did not know what lay waiting for her beyond the next hour. But as the boy trotted up beside her and slipped his small hand into hers, holding tight as if afraid she might dissolve into the air, she understood something. Whatever came next, she would not be walking into it alone. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, that thought did not frighten her at all. The wagon pulled away from the station at a slow and steady roll, its wooden wheels creaking in rhythm with the dirt road beneath them. Dust rose in soft, lazy clouds behind the horse, drifting upward into the warm afternoon air, like smoke rising from a fire that had nearly burned itself out. Maribel sat stiffly on the narrow wooden bench, her hands folded in her lap, the hem of her skirt grazing the floorboards. She could feel the eyes of the town on her back long after the platform had disappeared behind them. Whispers followed them like shadows, questions she could not hear but could feel pressing against her skin. Beside her, Eli sat close, his small shoulder bumping against hers, with every dip and rise in the road. He leaned into her without any hesitation, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. She was not sure whether she should gently pull back or simply let him stay there. In the end, she did neither, and simply let the moment be. Caleb drove without speaking, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the road. The muscles along his jaw moved steadily, as though he were silently working through thoughts he was not yet ready to give voice to. "You really don't need to take me far," Maribel said softly, after a while. "Just somewhere safe while I sort out what to do next." He glanced at her briefly, then returned his gaze to the road. "I won't leave you on the side of the road. Not today." That was all he offered. But there was something in the quiet certainty of his voice that calmed her nerves more than any elaborate reassurance could have. They traveled several miles through open silence. The land spread wide and unhurried around them, rolling fields and scattered trees and fences leaning under the slow, patient weight of time. It was beautiful in a lonely, wistful way, the kind of beauty that made you feel very small and, at the same time, very present in the world. When the ranch finally came into view, Maribel felt her chest tighten with something she could not quite name. It was not grand, but it was solid and sure. A wide porch wrapped around the front of the house. A barn stood off to one side, weathered with years, but kept with care. Everything about the place looked worn, but loved, as though someone had poured deep feeling into it and held on through the difficult years. "This is it," Caleb said simply. He climbed down and came around to help her, his hands firm and steady as he held her arm. She noticed the way he waited until both her feet were firmly on the ground before letting go. Eli hopped down beside her, already tugging at her sleeve with barely contained pride. "This is my house," he announced. "That's my room right up there." He pointed toward a window on the second floor. "And that's where Mama used to sit and do her sewing." The word fell between them like something fragile. Caleb cleared his throat. "Why don't we go inside? You look like you could use a glass of water." Inside, the house was quiet, but clearly lived in. Clean, but not in the careful, polished way of a house trying to impress. A man's home, maintained out of necessity and routine rather than sentiment. Boots stood by the door. A coat was draped over the back of a chair. The air held the faint, comforting scent of wood smoke and soap. Maribel took it all in slowly, letting the details anchor her. She had survived worse than this. Caleb filled a glass with water and set it in front of her, watching as she drank. When she finished, he nodded toward a chair. "Sit down." She did, gratefully, her knees suddenly weaker now that the adrenaline was draining away. Eli hovered nearby, watching her with wide and openly curious eyes. "I'm sorry about the scene at the station," she said quietly. "That wasn't something you caused," Caleb replied. "That man caused it. I should have been more careful about trusting him." He leaned back against the table and folded his arms. You did what you had to do. That doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. The gentleness in his voice nearly broke through her composure entirely. A silence settled between them, thick, but not uncomfortable. Finally, she spoke. I have no place to go. He gave one short nod. I know. I won't be any trouble, she added quickly. I can cook. I can clean. I'll work for my keep. I'm not here asking for charity. He studied her for a long moment, then let out a quiet breath. I won't pretend I have much to offer, he said. Just a roof, food on the table, and honest work. I won't mislead you. Life out here isn't easy. But if you need somewhere to stay for a while, then you're welcome to stay. Relief washed over her so suddenly and so completely that her eyes stung. Thank you, she whispered. Eli beamed at them both. You can have Mama's room, he said. Caleb shot him a look. Eli. It's all right, Maribel said gently. I'm perfectly happy with the spare room, if there is one. There is, Caleb said, the tension easing from his expression. You'll be comfortable enough there. The boy gave a satisfied nod, then reached over and took her hand. I'll show you. As he led her down the narrow hallway, Maribel glanced back once over her shoulder at Caleb. He stood in the doorway, watching them go, with an expression that she could not quite read. Something caught between worry and relief, between guarded hope and fear. She followed Eli into a small, simple bedroom with a single bed and a window that looked out over the open fields. Sunlight poured across the quilt like a quiet blessing. It's not fancy, Eli said, with a note of apology in his voice. It's perfect, she replied, and she meant it. He grinned and ran off, leaving her alone to settle in. Maribel sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of the day sink slowly into her bones. Her hands trembled as she smoothed the blanket beneath her palms. Everything she owned in the world sat in one small case at her feet. She let out a long, slow breath. She had come to Wyoming expecting to become a wife. Instead, she had become a stranger in an unfamiliar house, bound by circumstance to a man she barely knew, and a child who had already found his way into her heart. It was frightening, and yet something quiet inside her whispered that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She lay back on the bed and stared up at the ceiling, listening to the distant, ordinary sounds of the ranch. Boots on wood, a door swinging on its hinges, the low, steady murmur of a man speaking softly to his horses. For the first time since she had boarded that train weeks ago, her heartbeat slowed to something close to peace. Outside, the wind moved through the tall grass, carrying with it the faint but unmistakable feeling of change. And in that quiet, uncertain moment, Maribel allowed herself to hope. Perhaps, she thought, just perhaps, this broken and unplanned beginning might yet lead somewhere whole. Morning arrived gently at the Turner Ranch, not with bells or the rush of city noise, but with the soft creak of floorboards, the low, contented sounds of cattle, and pale sunlight drifting through thin curtains like a careful hand brushing Maribel softly awake. For a brief moment, she could not remember where she was. Then she heard a pan clatter somewhere downstairs, followed by the steady, purposeful sound of someone moving through the kitchen, and the faint, slightly off-key sound of a child humming to himself. Reality settled around her gently, like a warm blanket. She sat up slowly and smoothed her dress, then simply listened. The house felt alive in a way it had not the night before, less hollow, less burdened, still unfamiliar, but no longer frightening. She washed her face in the small basin, tidied her hair, and stepped out into the hallway. The scent of coffee and bacon drifted up the stairs, warm and grounding as anything she had ever known. When she reached the kitchen, she found Caleb standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, turning strips of bacon in a pan. Eli sat at the table, swinging his legs idly, humming to himself, a half-finished drawing, spread on the table before him. "Morning," Caleb said, glancing back over his shoulder. "Morning," she replied softly. Eli's face lit up. "You stayed," she smiled. "I said I would." He grinned as if he had spent all night quietly worrying she might not. Caleb set a plate down on the table. "Sit. You must be hungry." She hesitated only for a moment before taking the chair he pulled out for her. The simple thoughtfulness of the gesture wound itself tight around something in her chest. They ate together, in easy, comfortable quiet. The food was simple, eggs and bread and strong, hot coffee. But it tasted better than anything she could remember eating in weeks. When breakfast was finished, Caleb cleared his throat. "There are some things I should explain," he said, "about the ranch and about what I'd expect from day to day." She gave a steady nod. "I'd appreciate that." He leaned back against the counter and folded his arms. "I won't pretend that this place isn't demanding. There's work every single day, long days. Sometimes dangerous ones. I can't offer comfort or certainty, but I can offer fairness, and I won't go back on my word." She met his gaze directly. "That's all I need." He paused. "There's one more thing you ought to know. People in this town talk. They already know you came back with me from the station. The longer you stay, the more they'll have to say about it." "I expected that," she said quietly. "Some of what they say won't be true." She lifted her chin. "It already isn't." A flicker of something like approval moved across his face. "Good. Then you know what you're walking into." Eli slid off his chair and padded over to her, holding up a drawing with both hands. It showed a crooked little house, a tall man, a woman with long hair, and a much smaller figure standing between them, a hand clasped in each of theirs. "That's us," he announced proudly. Her throat tightened. "It's very good," she told him. "You can keep it," he said with complete seriousness. "So you remember that you belong here." Caleb opened his mouth, seemed to think better of it, and closed it again without a word. That morning, Maribel set to work in earnest. She scrubbed the kitchen from top to bottom, swept and mopped the floors, and sorted through cupboards that had clearly gone without proper attention for years. The work was a comfort. It gave her hands something useful to do, while her mind quietly processed everything that had happened to bring her here. By midday, she had found her rhythm. The house began to feel less like a stranger's space, and more like somewhere she might eventually fit herself. She stepped outside to hang the laundry, and found Caleb repairing a section of fence near the corral. Sweat darkened the back of his shirt. His movements were practiced and assured. He looked up when she appeared. "You don't have to take all that on yourself," he said. "I know," she replied. "I want to." He accepted this without pushing back, and they worked in easy, companionable silence for a time, the air filled with the rhythmic sound of hammering and the flutter and snap of cloth on the line. The sun climbed higher and warmed her face and hands. When she finally finished and turned around, she found Caleb looking at her. Not in the way men so often looked at women, with appraisal or something hungry in their eyes, but with something quieter, thoughtful. "Thank you," he said. "For what? For staying?" She paused. "I'm not sure how long I'll be able to," she said honestly. "I'll need to find some kind of work, something that doesn't tie me to your situation." His jaw tightened just slightly. "You can stay as long as you need to. I don't want to become a weight around your neck. You're not." They held each other's gaze. Something unspoken passed between them, in the space of that look. Then he turned back to his work, and she turned back to hers. That evening, as the sun eased itself down behind the hills and bled the sky with amber and gold, they sat together on the porch. Eli played at their feet, lining up small stones in careful rows and narrating his own private game in a soft, steady murmur. "You know," Caleb said at last, "he hasn't talked this much since his mother passed. Maribel watched the boy for a moment, then turned back to Caleb. He misses her terribly. Yes, his voice gentled. And he's afraid you'll disappear the same way she did. Her heart gave a sharp, tight squeeze. I won't. He studied her face carefully. You don't make promises that you don't mean, do you? No, she said quietly. I learned that lesson the hard way. The sun slipped further down. Long shadows stretched across the yard. I don't always know what the right thing is anymore, Caleb admitted, his voice low. I thought I did once. I thought keeping to myself, keeping my head down and grinding through each day was the way to survive. But then you arrived and suddenly everything shifted. I didn't intend to change anything, she said. I know, he replied. But sometimes the things we never plan for turn out to matter the most. She turned toward him and met his eyes. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Something fragile and unspoken hung in the air between them. Uncertain, tender, but unmistakably real. And for the first time since she had stepped off that train, Maribel felt something she had not allowed herself to reach for. Not safety, not certainty, but the quiet, careful flutter of possibility. The days found their shape and rhythm after that. Mornings began with the sound of boots on floorboards and the smell of fresh coffee threading through the house. Maribel learned the small, particular habits of the place, the way Caleb preferred his eggs, the way Eli always left his shoes just inside the door, never quite where they belonged, the way the wind shifted direction each day just before noon, as reliable as a clock. It was a simple life, but it had a steady, quiet pulse that did more to soothe her restless thoughts than anything else had in a long time. She made herself useful wherever she could find a way. She mended shirts that had gone too long without attention, scrubbed the floors until they gleamed, and learned which cupboards held what and which drawers stuck. She coaxed bread from stubborn dough and learned to calm the old mare when something startled her. Each small task gave her a sense of purpose she had not felt in longer than she could easily remember. Caleb noticed, though he was not a man who said much about what he saw. Sometimes she would catch him watching her from the doorway, his expression difficult to read. Other times, he seemed to find reasons to stay outside longer than necessary, as though he were giving her space to move through the house and make it feel like hers. He never asked questions about where she came from or what had brought her to this point, and she never offered the information on her own. The silence between them became a kind of quiet understanding, and she found she was grateful for it. Eli, however, was constitutionally opposed to silence. He filled every available moment with chatter and questions and stories that began somewhere and wandered freely without ever quite arriving. He laughed at his own jokes before he reached the end of them, and she listened to all of it with warmth and patience, giving him the full attention he clearly craved and needed. One afternoon, as she stood folding laundry at the kitchen table, he climbed up onto the bench beside her. "Will you read to me later?" he asked. "Of course I will," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "You won't go away like Mama did, will you?" The question landed with more weight than she had expected. She set down the shirt she was folding and looked at him steadily. "I'm not planning to go anywhere," she told him. He studied her face the way he always did, searching for something to hold on to. Then he gave a small nod and leaned against her side, apparently satisfied. From the doorway, Caleb watched the whole exchange unfold without a word. Something in his chest tightened, sharp and unfamiliar. He turned away before either of them could see it. That evening, a storm rolled in without a single word of warning. The sky darkened early and dramatically, clouds massing thick and low. Wind rattled the window frames and thunder rumbled long and deep across the open plains. Maribel stood at the kitchen sink, watching rain streak down the glass. The sound of it pulled at old memories she would rather have left undisturbed. Caleb came to stand beside her, without making a fuss of it. Storms out here can get serious, he said. Sometimes they last all night. She nodded, her eyes still on the glass. I don't mind storms. He glanced at her. No, I've lived through worse. The rain intensified, drumming hard against the roof. Lightning split the dark sky and flooded the room with brilliant white light for a single, breathless second. Thunder followed immediately, sharp and close enough to shake the walls. From down the hall, Eli cried out. Maribel was moving before she had consciously decided to, hurrying toward the sound. She found him sitting bolt upright in bed, eyes wide, breathing too fast. It's all right, she said softly, settling herself on the edge of his mattress. It's just the storm passing through. I don't like the loud parts, he said, gripping her sleeve. I know, she said. She brushed his hair back from his forehead gently. Listen to me carefully. The storm cannot reach you in here. You are safe. He pressed himself against her, still trembling. She wrapped her arms around him and held on, steady and unhurried, until his breathing gradually slowed and evened out. From the hallway, Caleb stood watching in silence. Something that had been locked tight inside him for a long time came quietly loose. You can stay with him tonight, he said softly. If you'd like to. She looked up at him, a little surprised. Are you sure about that? He nodded. He trusts you. She stayed. Outside, the storm raged on, rain hammering the roof and thunder cracking and rolling. Inside, Maribel sat on the edge of Eli's bed and hummed quietly, low and steady, until the boy drifted back to sleep, his small fist still curled around her sleeve. When the house had finally gone still, she rose carefully and stepped out into the hallway. Caleb was still there, leaning against the wall with his arms folded. Thank you, he said. For what? For being here when he needed someone. She hesitated for just a moment. He needs you too, you know. His jaw tightened. I know that. I just don't always know how to give him what he needs. She looked at him steadily, taking in the exhaustion that lived just beneath the surface of his composure. You're trying, she said quietly. That means more than you think. Their eyes met, and for a long moment the air between them felt charged with everything that had not yet been said. The thunder moved further off. The house settled around them. Outside, the rain dropped to a whisper. Inside, something shifted between them. It was not declared. It was not named, but both of them felt it. The sense that the lines they had drawn were slowly dissolving, that what had begun as necessity was quietly, carefully becoming something else, something tender, something that neither of them moved a step away from. The storm left the land clean and new behind it. Morning came in slowly, pale and tentative, sunlight stretching itself across the fields, as if testing how much warmth the world was ready to receive. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and for the first time since Maribel had arrived, the quiet around her did not carry an ache. She rose before anyone else stirred and slipped outside. The ground was soft and cool beneath her boots, still damp with dew. Birds were waking in the trees, shaking water loose from their feathers. She breathed in the clean morning air and let the stillness settle around her like something welcome. She did not hear Caleb approach until he spoke. You're up early. She turned to find him a few steps behind her. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. His hair was still damp from washing. He looked tired, but differently tired than before, as if something inside him had rested, even if the rest of the world had not let him. I couldn't sleep any longer, she said. The air felt too quiet to stay indoors. He gave a slow nod. That's what storms do. They take all the noise with them when they leave. They stood side by side for a moment without speaking. The space between them felt altered now, less uncertain, more delicate. I didn't mean to overstep last night, she said softly. With Eli, I mean. He shook his head. You did exactly what he needed. She glanced at him carefully. And you? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I didn't know until last night how much I needed it too. The honesty in his voice surprised her. She looked away, giving him room to continue if he wanted to. I've been trying to do all of this on my own, he said. Raising him, keeping the ranch together, keeping myself together. I told myself that needing help was the same as failing. She turned back toward him. It isn't. He met her eyes. Something in his expression eased, just a little. The kind of easing that comes not from relief, but from finally being seen. Maybe not, he said. They stood together as the sun climbed steadily higher, and the quiet between them became something comfortable and shared. Later that morning, Caleb headed out to repair fencing on the far edge of the property. Maribel offered to come along and help, but he shook his head. You've already done more than enough. Stay close to the house today. She watched him ride out, then turned back inside. There were chores enough to keep her hands busy, but her thoughts kept wandering. She found herself pausing often to listen for the sound of his boots on the porch or the distant sound of Eli's laughter. When the boy came bursting into the kitchen with an armful of crooked sticks, she raised an eyebrow. What exactly are those for? A fort, he announced, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Outside? Papa said I could build one as long as I didn't break anything important. She laughed softly. That sounds like a very sensible agreement. They spent the morning together outside, constructing something entirely imperfect and completely magnificent. Eli worked with fierce and total concentration, his tongue between his teeth, stopping every few minutes to ask for her opinion. Does this part look right? He would ask. It looks strong, she would say. That's the part that matters. He grinned every time she said it. By the time Caleb came riding back across the field, the fort stood proudly near the fence line, a cheerful tangle of sticks and determination and imagination. He dismounted and surveyed the structure with raised brows and a quietly impressed expression. Well, he said, that's something. Eli puffed out his chest with enormous satisfaction. We built it together. Caleb looked across at Maribel, something warm and unguarded passing through his expression for just a moment. I can see that, he said. That afternoon, new clouds began to gather and stack. The wind picked up with purpose, rattling the branches overhead. You should come in now, Caleb said. There's another storm coming. They barely made it through the door before the sky broke open. Rain came down in sheets, pounding the roof with a sound like drumming. Thunder rolled overhead, deep and insistent, and Eli flinched hard at each crack of it. Maribel was beside him before she had even thought about it, kneeling down to his level. It's all right, she said softly. I'm right here. He reached for her sleeve and held on. She wrapped an arm around his small shoulders, solid and steady, and did not let go. From across the room, Caleb watched them. Something moved through him that he had not been expecting, and did not quite know what to do with. He had never intended for any of this, had spent 2 years making sure nothing could get close enough to matter this much. The storm raged on, louder and wilder than the one before it. But inside the house there was warmth. There was safety. There was something that felt, dangerously and wonderfully, like more than survival. As the rain finally began to ease, Eli's breathing softened. He leaned heavily against Maribel, more asleep than awake. Caleb crossed the room and spoke quietly. You're good for him, she looked up at him. I care about him, she said simply. He held her gaze. And for me, he added, his voice low. Her heart gave a sudden, unsteady beat. I don't want to cause either of you any pain. You're not, he said, without wavering. You're helping us find our way back. The words landed between them quietly, carrying more weight than either of them had quite planned for. She looked down at the sleeping boy, then back up at Caleb. I don't know how long I'll stay, she admitted. I can't promise anything. I know, he said. and I'm not asking you to." The storm outside drew itself down to a soft, steady murmur. The light beyond the windows shifted and turned golden once more. For a long, quiet moment, the three of them simply existed together in that small room, bound by circumstance and by something else, something unspoken and growing, that none of them had planned for, and none of them quite wanted to name. Neither of them said it aloud, but both of them knew. This was no longer merely shelter from the storm. It was beginning, slowly and undeniably, to feel like home. Morning came soft and still, as if the world outside were holding its breath. Maribel stood at the window, watching the sun lift itself above the distant hills, the ranch lying quiet below in the early light. Something in the stillness felt different today, heavier with meaning, more deliberately poised, like a moment waiting for its courage. She heard footsteps behind her and turned. Caleb stood in the doorway, his expression carefully arranged, though something beneath it was working to get through. "You're up early," he said. "I couldn't sleep," she replied. "There's too much I keep turning over in my mind." He gave a small nod, understanding more from that than she had actually said. They stood there, in the half-light of early morning, the silence between them full to the brim with everything that had not yet been spoken. At last, he cleared his throat. "There is something I've been meaning to tell you," he said. "Something I should have said before now." She turned fully toward him, her heart giving a careful, nervous beat. "I didn't ask you to stay because I needed help managing the house," he said slowly. "And I didn't ask because Eli needed someone around, even though he did. I asked because I was afraid of what it felt like to be alone. And I needed to stop being afraid of admitting that." The honesty in his voice reached into her chest and held on. "I lost my wife 2 years ago," he continued, his voice quieter now. "After that, everything went flat. I kept moving, kept working, kept getting up each morning, because Eli needed me to. But inside, I was empty in a way I didn't know how to fix. And then you stepped off that train and the house stopped feeling so silent. I could breathe again," she swallowed, against the tightness rising in her throat. "I never wanted to step into her place," she said gently. "I would never want that." "I know," he said, "and I would never ask it of you. What I'm trying to say is that you brought something back into this house that I had given up on ever having again." They stood facing each other in the early morning light, the weight of everything they had held back pressing quietly between them. "I don't know exactly what this is," she said at last, "but I know I don't want to lose it." He took one slow step toward her. "Neither do I." The space between them narrowed, not quickly, not urgently, but with great care. His hand lifted, paused for just a breath, and then came to rest gently against hers. She did not move away. In that quiet, unhurried moment, something settled between them. Not a vow, not a declaration, but a shared and honest understanding. A decision made not with words, but with the simple act of staying. Then a small, sleepy voice drifted in from the hallway. "Papa,